All right. So welcome, everyone. We're so thrilled to have you here with us. We're going to have a fantastic conversation. So as you all are probably quite aware, there's a lot of interesting things happening in the world of technology right now. Everything about our lives and our jobs and our world is being disrupted. And you're in the heart of one of the places here in Kendall Square where a lot of that's happening. MIT is an engine for new technologies, and MIT Technology Review has been leading the conversation on the technologies that matter for well over 100 years. So we are working together with our partner, EnterpriseDB, on thinking about what are the exciting things happening in open source. Open source is dramatically impacting and changing the way we think about IT and actually opening the doors for a lot of really cool innovations. So we're going to have a very interesting conversation here. We've assembled an all-star panel who are going to share their insights and ideas and thoughts and experiences. But we're also in a fairly intimate, safe setting here that we want to hear from you. So I've got a ton of questions here for this panel on my iPad, but I'm going to open up pretty early to you to have you share. Obviously questions are great, but also insights and ideas are great too. So without further ado, I'm going to ask each of my esteemed panelists, starting Jim, we'll start with you down there.
Sit down here first and be last.
Jim and I are old buddies on panels. To introduce yourself, tell us where you're from, and tell us what's keeping you up at night right now.
Lots of things. So I'm Jim Lammers. I am the Chief Technology and Chief Information Officer at Verisk Health, headquartered out in Waltham. Prior to that, I've actually only been there about 6 months. Prior to that, I was the Chief Technology Officer at Express Scripts. What is keeping me up at night? Lots of things. But in the area of healthcare, which I've been in for about 15 years now, it's really this struggle of how do you continue to drive innovation and think about new things in a highly regulated setting where there's always somebody looking over your back. Everybody's worried about privacy. But you're sitting across the table and they also want to have a Amazon experience, or they want to be able to deal with analytics that is, way out there and things like that to really help try to change and deal with innovation, especially in healthcare where there's more uncertainty than certainty into the future of what we're going to be doing. So it's really, every single day I read a new article or a new interesting thing, and it's all about how do we take that and put that into healthcare. So it's really how do you balance in a highly regulated environment innovation and change and really almost predict what's going to be happening in healthcare. So.
Awesome. I'm going to mix it up, actually, and we're going to go to Ed next. Yeah, we've got to keep them on their toes.
Great, thanks. My name is Ed Boyajian. I'm the president and CEO of EnterpriseDB, and I have been in the open source business for a number of years now. I have the good fortune to spend about 7 years at Red Hat, and I've been here for about 8 years. So, I'm not sure commercial open source has been around much more than 15 years. So I've had the good fortune to be working with innovative, progressive technology and business models for some time. And what keeps me up most at night now, as I think we're at the beginning of a wave of change with regard to adoption of open source. And as in our company, we're being asked, we're database guys, and as database guys that kind of go up against Oracle, our enterprise customers are looking across this landscape of data technologies and open source and looking to us to help them sort out how do we piece this together when we compare what you guys do to the monolithic big proprietary guys. And it's a hard set of problems to solve for our customers, and it's a complex set of problems for us to solve as vendors and guys who support open source projects. So that's kind of top of mind right now, and I think that's because users are starting to really adapt to more open source technologies in data management.
Awesome, Ed, thank you. All right, Steve.
All right. Hi, my name is Steve Pember. I am the most underdressed person on this panel. And I'm also the CTO of a company called ThirdChannel, which is a startup here in Kendall. There's no real 30-second elevator pitch. It takes about 5 minutes to describe it, but I'm happy to tell anyone about it later. We're small. Yeah, we're a small but growing rapidly startup. The things that keep me up at night, besides the things that would normally keep a startup up at night, I need to hire developers. Can I afford them? Did I make the right technology choice? Will we be here next month, et cetera, et cetera. Specifically related to open source are things like, and hopefully I'll get into this in a bit, but is the big technology that, some massive open source tool that I've chosen and used everywhere, will that still be maintained by its core developers, next year? What happens if I have to suddenly replace this massive tool that I rely upon?
I don't think Steve sleeps.
No, I also have a 2-year-old. Sorry, go on.
Oh, geez. You really don't sleep. And I've saved the best for last, Ms. Lockwood.
I'm Lauren Lockwood. I'm the Chief Digital Officer for the City of Boston. My background is entirely private sector. I did not expect to work in the public sector. But this is a really exciting time in government. The sort of wave or groundswell of interest in civic tech following the sort of healthcare.gov fiasco has been really incredible. And so I am very fortunate. I'm really excited to be working in at this intersection of civic technology at a time when this is happening, and there is a much greater adoption and understanding of open source, whether we're talking about open data or open source IT solutions. So that's all very exciting. What keeps me up at night? My 9-month-old. And in addition to that, I think we are constantly thinking about this. There's a really big difference between making something, a tool, information, nominally available and then truly accessible. And so we're constantly thinking about how do we bridge that gap, and not just how do we bridge that gap today, but how do we bridge that gap for our constituents' needs, projecting 3, 5, 10 years down the road. So all those things.
Fantastic. Thank you. Good. All right. So in the audience, I would love to know who works for a large organization, an organization that has 500 or more people. Large. Small organization than the rest? Awesome. Okay. So just a little level setting. So to continue the level setting, I want to toss it back to Ed. And Ed, give us sort of the big picture on the market and sort of where you see it going and where you see opportunities.
Sure. I think, I've been around open source technology, as I mentioned, for a while now, and I think there have been two big waves of open source adoption. I think we're kind of at the beginning of the second wave. And the first wave happened around replatforming. It's kind of a normal time where certainly in the software tech industry, big things change. And the first wave of replatforming was when everyone's kind of moving off of the old Unix hardware onto commodity x86 architectures. And there was a big economic savings in making that hardware move. And if you think about it, that's when kind of Linux came onto the scene. And it makes sense, right? Because, after you put a chip on a piece of physical hardware, what's the next most prolific thing? An operating system. And so it's not, no great shock that in that hardware move, there was this window of opening for open source to kind of proliferate. And I think, especially in cases where something is as ubiquitous as an OS, you see this kind of expansion outward of opportunity, and Red Hat's become, I think I was looking today, I think they're reporting earnings are now in excess of $2 billion a year run rate in revenue. So you kind of see that, I see that as the first big wave of open source adoption. And of course, with the first wave, people got comfortable with a lot of things, got comfortable with this idea of what open source is, they got comfortable with subscription-based licensing models, they got comfortable with, dealing with the GPL and other open source style licenses. But I think we find ourselves at the beginning of a second big wave of open source adoption, and it's actually, interestingly, also tied to replatforming. And the replatforming today is happening around the movement from, kind of traditional physical on-prem infrastructures, which are still pretty prolific, to utility-style computing or cloud-like computing. And I don't mean just public cloud. I just mean the idea that infrastructure being used as a utility started with virtualization. We now see it more prolific with, with public cloud technologies and private cloud technologies. But this idea that that backbone is being re-platformed into a utility. And so as that's changing, that I think is creating the second big wave of open source adoption. And it's colliding with, I think, a few really important events. One is this absolute proliferation of data. And it's accessible, more is available, and more companies now want to define their businesses around how they use that data. I think the second is there's resulting more mature open source data technologies and more mature companies than ever before. And then I think we've got users who are just exhausted from the kind of the expense treadmill of the big proprietary vendors, and everybody complains about the money they spend on this. But if you step back from it, in the data management landscape, the single biggest expense category in software IT is database or database management, $40 billion. There's not one other category that's actually that big across all of IT. And so it's also, like Linux, really prolific, because what's the next most common thing on a piece of physical hardware after an operating system? Maybe argue middleware and then databases. And so this idea that in the data management landscape, we're kind of at the front edge of this transformation, it all starts to make sense. What I'd highlight is, kind of relates to my first comment, that I think the challenge today, to kind of break through, is the complexity of assembling open source tech vendors. Because you know what? You can complain about the big proprietary guys, but they package everything together and you can get it from one shop. And that may be pricey, but there's less risk in that model. But the economic advantage is so large that I think people are kind of trading off that risk for open source. And naturally they're turning to their vendors and companies like ours to say, how do we bring together these data management technologies in open source to help solve this array of problems that we're used to dealing with the big guys to solve. But that, I think, whereas, and I've been doing EnterpriseDB now for 8 years, even 6, 7 years ago, that was a big challenge. In the past 2 to 3 years, it's changed dramatically. People are acting on that now and not waiting. And so that, I think that's why I call this the beginning of the second big wave of open source adoption. And I predict that it'll dwarf the accomplishments, the great accomplishments of things like Linux, as we look forward.
Perfect. So I think, based on our conversation earlier, I think Steve is sort of riding the speedboat over the second wave, and it seems like you were scaling pretty rapidly and really harnessing open source. Tell us how you're doing that.
Sure. So again, like I said earlier, I work for a very small startup. We just hired our 5th engineer. We've been running for about 3 years now. I've been there for about 2.5. We've had the fortune to be able to build our platform, because it's from the ground up. And so I'm more of a technologist at heart, so if this was, say, an architecture-related meeting, I'd be happy to just elaborate. Has anyone here heard of the term microservices or distributed architecture? Yeah. So on one hand, we've adopted that strategy, and it's proven to be a huge advantage for us. But on the other hand, as those of you know what that is, it's basically, or those who don't know what it is, it basically means that instead of building one massive, architectural component and just, running it on a server somewhere, you build a bunch of small little ones, and you have them all. You set up a communication layer between all of them. It's much easier for developers to think about one small chunk as opposed to the whole big thing, and it allows you to deploy the units individually. In case something goes wrong, you can throw it out and start all over again. You can scale them up individually, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the most important characteristics is it allows for fast growth and rapid agility for new trends in the market or new customer demands, et cetera, et cetera. And so we could have gone, but you can build those units out of anything you want. And we chose to go fully open source for every single thing that we do. one service may be better with something like Node.js, one tool may be better with something like Spring. Postgres is, of course, the best database ever, so we use that for everything. But using any sort of proprietary vendor is a no-go for us. It's a small startup. We have a shoestring budget as it is, so there's no way we'd be able to go for anything like Oracle. Nor would I want to, right? Because from a business perspective, it's much easier to hire developers that are focused on open source. I fundamentally believe that everything exciting that's happening in computation is coming out of the open source world, right? No one you've ever met has ever been really jazzed about the latest version of Oracle. Have they? Have you ever met anyone? And yet, and I use this line out there, people will come to blows over arguing AngularJS versus React.js, right? People get really excited about this stuff. And so it makes it much easier to bring on developers if you say, hey, we get to work with some of the latest and greatest new technologies that are coming out there. Let's test them out, see if they work for us. If they don't, we'll try something else.
So that's actually an interesting angle, that it's makes hiring and finding and sourcing talent easier.
Vastly easier.
Ah, very good tip. Love it. Okay, let's get a perspective from those riding the ocean liner. Lauren, you want to jump in there?
We have a cruise ship, yeah. I actually would echo a lot of what you had to say. We were just actually talking about how we had a developer position sit open for 2 years. And that was, the central developer for the city's web team sat open for 2 years because we were asking for somebody with a progressive mentality, but who knew .NET. And you don't find that cross section of people. It might exist. It's just not very common. And so, once we released our sort of pilot version of our website in Drupal, well, then we got flooded with resumes. And it's amazing how that talent pool really opens up for you. But in addition to the talent pool and in addition to the economics, I think one of the really important things for us is, the RFP, for those who don't know, the procurement process for government is very long, and so we can't do it all the time. And so the fact that open source software advances and evolves much more quickly than needing to go back to Oracle every time some new advancement comes out, and Facebook allows you to log in with Facebook, and ask Oracle to build it for you. That just happens with Drupal or another open source software. So we also have the benefit of, we don't know what our constituents are going to need in 5 years. And so the best we can do is procure solutions that allow us to be adaptable. And so that I would say that, in addition to, of course, the economics, and the huge benefit of being able to hire developers, I think are all huge for us.
Awesome. Let's see. Jim, what type of boat are you on? A hospital ship?
Sometimes
Medical
it feels
events.
sinking. No, I'm actually, it's been a big change going from Express Scripts where, it had $100 billion in revenue and an IT budget, bigger than all these organizations combined, to where I am right now. It's been a dramatic shift. It's still not tiny. It's bigger than a startup, but we've been around. The real, clearly hiring is a big element of this, and I can tell you the stories of how people, and in fact the battles in the hallways even at Express Scripts about which technology to go and why are we using IBM or Oracle or Microsoft or whatever else. So it's definitely a big piece of it. But one of the advantages in my new role that open source has really provided is this ability to create with almost no risk. And so what we're running into right now is, so my company grew through 9 acquisitions over 8 years. So I have 15 platforms and
Wow.
20 products. So as we look into the future of a very highly dynamic marketplace in healthcare, how do we pick and where do we want this thing to go? And we have really 2 extremes. Half of our companies were almost transaction processing, and half of them were analytics. So there is no one size that's going to fit all for the future state of the organization and where we need to go. So what open source has really allowed us to do and really get a group of people together is get everybody in a room and take some different directions. In fact, we've got a couple teams right now that are actually competing against each other to try to solve the same problem and looking at some different solutions. You can't do that because of you can't do that with any kind of proprietary software. because you're dealing with the fact of, okay, I'm making a multi-year investment at the end of the quarter or at the end of the year so I can get the best deal possible, and locking myself up for years. In fact, we've had this debate internally because one of the acquisitions went in with a multi-year deal with a vendor, that we're still holding on to a whole bunch of licenses that we continually go after battles about should we use them or not, because if we use them, we're propagating the problem, and if we don't use them, we're wasting money that we've already spent. But it's really the open source opportunity is really to create with low risk and not be afraid to throw it away. In fact, the model and the discussions that we've had with the team has whatever you build, we're going to throw away in 18 months. So don't be afraid to make mistakes. Let's find the future and figure this out where we're going to go along. And you can't do that if I had to go and have a bake-off between, DB2 and Oracle RAC. So anyway, it's really opened some doors, and it really, once again, back to the people side of it, it creates tremendous excitement. There's not a lot of opportunities. You go through your career, you don't get a lot of opportunities to start almost with a blank sheet to go build something new. And the advantage I have is I actually have a company that has paying customers. So we actually have some revenue behind us, so I'm not kept up at night because I'm not sure we're going to make payroll. But it's really a great opportunity to go and explore and figure out where we're going to go and pick the right solution and really build energy in the organization.
Cool. So speaking of customers, it sort of strikes me that everyone in this room is one of Lauren's customers. And I'm curious, Lauren, how are you serving us and what new things are you doing?
That's a great question. Actually, if you live in Cambridge, you're not technically part of the city of Boston.
I do live in Boston.
That's something I learned when I actually went to the city. I had to live in the city limits, so I had to move from Cambridge over to Boston. But no, there are obviously a lot of the things we're thinking about, and I think one of the most striking things for me, coming from the private sector, where you have a niche audience you're going after, is that you're really serving everyone. So you are serving that 90-year-old grandpa who lives in Dorchester, and you are serving that techie, millennial that you are hoping to keep in Boston after they graduate from MIT. So you're really serving everybody, and so we have to figure out how to find tools that are intuitive, as best we can. And I think the important thing that we're always thinking about too is, and we all, I'm sure, are thinking about, is how do we reach users where they are? And for a lot of our constituents, that's on their mobile device. That was not the case when we last redesigned our website in 2006. And so, the software that we installed in 2006 right now left us with a website that isn't mobile responsive. And that is a huge problem for a lot of reasons. And Google deprioritizes you in search results. The biggest thing, though, is that we have great data that lower income residents are increasingly using mobile phones as their primary access to the internet. They're doing things like applying for jobs on their phones. So there are a lot of ways people are using devices, and it's a really big problem if they can't get essential services on their phones. So it's one example of how our inability to predict that thing that was going to be important in the future really has stalled our ability to deliver services for the people who need it most. And so what we focus on mostly is how do we create those cool new things, but in a way that serves many people. And so that involves a lot of, you can imagine, user testing and going out and meeting with the public, discovering that it is not, in fact, intuitive that a hamburger menu means menu for people. So there are a lot of things that we've learned along the way, but the key for us is having the tools that enable us to quickly change based off of what we're learning and our constituents' needs change.
Awesome. Ed, how are you thinking about your customers, and how are they surprising you these days?
I think we see them evolving really quickly. And what that looks like to us is, in almost all cases, they have big ambitions to change the cost dynamics in their business. That's kind of a universal truth. But they don't really know exactly how to go about doing it in the context of open source software. And so they start with small projects. And I think one of the things that we find we have to do is kind of not only help be there when they're ready for that tech change, but also more and more, they're looking to us to be the counselors and to bring the best practices and the insights from other customers on how to go about making that change, and then really looking to us to kind of how do we bring other players to the table and come together. So it's pretty interesting, and it's happening fast. We're investing heavily in people to try to keep keep our skills at a high level in order to meet those changing needs. Which from my perspective are accelerating.
Yeah. Yeah. So Steve, you're in the Steve boat, the speedboat, the Steve boat. We'll call it the Steve boat now. So I think Ed just sort of raised an interesting point of how do you keep the skills of your team really on the cutting edge?
Well, that's a really good question. So. There's several ways. One of the ones that I like the most is to, and this is nothing related to open source, but to set aside budget for trainings and for our developers to attend conferences. So we set aside a couple grand and let them go to some sort of technology conference every year to come back and learn about the latest and greatest that's going on in some sort of area.
Tech is in October.
Fair enough.
And Postgres Vision is in October.
Are they in Boston?
Let's see, Postgres Vision is in San Francisco.
No, it's very expensive.
Oh, we've got a deal for you, Steve. You're on our team. And MTech is here in Boston.
Very good. So conferences are great. One of the advantages, on a side note, one of the advantages of the whole microservice approach is that it gives the developers freedom to explore in this small little isolated unit. And if they want to try something new and it's not going to rock the boat too much because you want to keep them in a general wheelhouse of technologies. Like if you're building a lot of things in Java and they want to build something in something like Erlang, no one knows Erlang, so we're probably not going to use that choice. But as long as it's something new in that area, there's freedom to explore and grow and try things out without destroying everything else, if that makes any sense. And then we generally have a roundtable. Not roundtable. We generally have discussions periodically about some of the latest technologies we're running into. I've given presentations about things that I've learned to the team. I don't know if they've actually listened. They probably were doing some of this.
Yes.
Yeah. So generally just conferences and allowing our developers the freedom to explore. Because I found that the developers like to have some sort of outlet for innovation. And allowing them, sure, you can say, hey, do it on your own time, but that's not really that great. And Google had that 20% time policy where they could work on something new. As a startup, we can't really afford that. So allowing them a little sandbox to play in is I think a good way to learn and a good morale booster for them.
Awesome, great. Okay, I have a lot more questions, but do we have burning questions in the audience here? Laird has a mic over there. So if you've got either a question, and I usually don't allow comments, but I'm allowing comments tonight. If you'd like to also make a comment, you're welcome. All right, nothing burning yet? All right, excellent. Then, let's see, I'm going to throw it back over to Jim. Now, Jim, you told us all already about the competition that you do. I'd love to hear, tell us a gruesome story about perhaps a transition that you made and that you made an awesome choice or perhaps you learned from an error. That's a curveball.
Yeah.
Or answer something completely different if you feel like
No. Well, when you were talking about gruesome, I actually had a different thought that popped into my head. So maybe I'll take that angle.
Go for it.
And then I'll come, if you want me to talk about something that didn't go well, I can talk about that too. So here was a gruesome situation. So I joined this company 6 months ago. Don't know that we were in the middle of a private equity buyout. Oh. So I joined and then got thrown right into the mix. And so there was a numerous number of private equity firms looking and doing their due diligence, and it was a fantastic way for me to learn what's going on in the organization because I'm sitting there in front of these guys telling them all about this technology that I learned about 5 minutes ago in the hallway from a phone call with somebody in Utah. So great learning experience for me. But it came down to it, through the due diligence process, they asked the question, are you compliant with all your open source licensing? And we asked the question, we didn't really have a good answer. And so we had to go and conduct an open source audit. And I will tell you the level of nervousness and it was actually much worse with the parent company. So my company was part of a subsidiary of a publicly traded company that we were spinning off. So the parent company was petrified. In fact, we spent 12 hours over a weekend discussing the results from the open source audit just to determine what we should do and how we should share it with the private equity firms that were asking about it. In the end, it was a great lesson in making sure that the tremendous opportunity with open source and costs and creativity and drive and quickly adapting and contributions and things like that, there's some things you also have to be careful about. And it taught me very, very well that you need to take and you do need to have some management practices around open source. In our case, we had a couple licenses that required us to go and buy the permanent licenses. So if you're not careful, the license we downloaded was for development use only. And that if you wanted to get into a production environment, you had to pay a licensing fee. So we went through that, and honestly, the fees weren't that high because we put it all on somebody's corporate card, and it was fine. But you just have to be worried. You have to be cautious and aware that these situations exist. So there's so much upside to it, but going into it with your eyes wide open is also not a good practice. And it's going to potentially get you into trouble. And so there are many different scenarios, and you have to be very careful with the licensing on this stuff. And so there are people out there in the open source community, just like with the internet, that are looking to make their buck. Mm-hmm. And you need to be careful about that as well. So I did not answer your question.
No, but that was sufficiently gruesome. I want to see if Lauren can top it.
That's a tough one.
Oh,
I
would
got more
imagine
if
in
you
the
have
city
more.
of Boston there might be some gruesome stories.
No,
or
I mean,
how you turn something around.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're all obviously constantly learning too, and I think one thing that's really tough is that something like having an open source website sounds wonderful, but it requires so much innovation at every layer of the organization. So you have to have a hiring process that's aligned to that. You have to have a budgeting process that can understand how to interpret something like that, because everything's used to. In fact, I think some places probably get their templates from Oracle for procurements. So it does require a lot of coordination across the organization, and I think. A lot of our lessons, we're further ahead, I think, as it relates to open data. And we're learning a lot there because we've had a lot of siloed data sets that have always existed in separate places, in separate departments, under separate technologies. And even if you anonymize each of those individually, when you put them together, they're not always anonymous anymore. And so you can build a picture of a constituent potentially if you have enough information. And so there are a lot of things that we've become aware of before putting it out there. But it is one of those things where you're ready to launch something, and somebody raises their hand in the corner of the room saying, if you had this piece of information, you can tie it to this data set to tie it to this one, and then we have a problem. And so we've had a few situations like that where we've been lucky to keep that in-house. We did discover it beforehand, but it's definitely something that's come up a number of times.
Fantastic. Ed, can you top that?
How can I top it? Give me the basic. You want me to beat the?
No, I'm just kidding. I can. Do you have a gruesome story of a lesson learned the hard way?
I don't know gruesome, but I'll give you a big lesson learned. We've been helping customers move off of proprietary databases, and we've really invested. I mean, mostly Oracle, because Oracle's half the market, and so not surprisingly, and we've invested a tremendous amount of time in engineering software, in Postgres, to make that easier to do. And I think we've been successful at that. But as we've moved up the food chain with some of the biggest customers, we had kind of a awakening moment, and we were wondering, like, why do we seem to be stalling in some of these some of these companies who are like really struggling? It's really obvious the economics work, but we're not ready. And the aha moment, which maybe felt to me like it came later than it should have, was this reuse of the licenses because you got them sitting on the shelf,
Right.
is this idea that we didn't just have to help people re-engineer their software,
Yeah.
and it helped them re-engineer their contracts.
Right.
And because if you think about what the big technology vendors have historically done, they spent a lot of time engineering contracts that kept you locked in. And to fix that problem, you got to re-engineer the licensing side of the business, not just the software side of the business. Really, like it was an aha moment and a kind of a big kind of awakening for us in the past couple of years.
Yeah. No, it sort of really builds, I think. You did it. You built on what Lauren talked about as the whole system. If you're doing open source, the whole system needs to be built around that. And you need to really think that through. So awesome. Okay, so who wants to hear about Steve's company and his 5-minute pitch about what it does? Okay. Oh, wow.
Wow. Okay.
Steve, there you go.
Wow. Okay.
See if you can do it in 3.
All right. Let's see if I can do it in 3. So, I already killed some time. So the problem we're trying to solve is that when a company that makes a product, so some of our flagship clients are Oakley sunglasses, GoPro camera, Under Armour, several different golf club brands I don't play golf, so I don't know anything about. Anyway, of course. Oh, be happy to. So when our clients tend to be big name retail brands. When they make a product, let's say Oakley sunglasses produce 2,000 units, they don't sell that to you directly in a physical store. They hand that over to something like a Dick's Sporting Goods or a Target. Once they hand that over, they have no idea what happens to those units. So those 2,000 units could just be sitting on a loading dock somewhere in the back of a Target in Mississippi. Or they could be sitting in the back room and not on display. Or the people that are on the floors, the staff members don't know anything about the latest lens technology. And yet, as part of this sales agreement that the store takes these units and then sells them, is that these brands have to participate in what's called sell-through. And typically this takes the form of putting, every brand in the store puts in money in a pot, and then these stores, a Target or a Costco, will hire these billion-dollar companies to, and believe it or not, this is the industry term, hire Mabels on the table. They tend to be old ladies with hairnets that hand out cups of Chobani yogurt. Have you seen those people? Or you go to a liquor store and there's somebody offering you, a glass of wine. That lady will typically be in a Costco the next day, or in a I don't know. And so these companies have been around forever, and their business model is to do what's called the merchandising. They hand out samples, they clean up displays, they educate staff, blah blah blah. But there's no feedback to the clients. So we're doing 2 things. We send representatives that are tailored towards that brand. So for GoPro, you get typically somebody who goes skydiving on the weekend, already knows everything there is about all the GoPro cameras. They go in and they go, "Hey, how's it going? I'm the guy from GoPro. You're going surfing this weekend? Let me show you what lens goes with this camera and what head mount to put on your helmet." They answer all the customers' questions. They educate staff. They go in the back room. They bring out stock. They make it look nice because you can't sell anything if it's not on the shelf. But they're also entering feedback and observational data into mobile devices. So our clients, which again tend to be the brands, see this real-time view of everything that's happening in the stores they're in around the country. They're doing things like competitor analysis, inventory management, things like that. And then we're also taking sales data and combining that with this observational data we're getting to provide feedback to the term for the people we send in stores is agent, to our agents. So when they go in the next time, they know to try, let's say the top 5% of targets in your area are doing X, maybe you should try doing X since your target is in the bottom 5% of stores in the area. So there's a lot going on there. So in addition to everything that you might think that I need to build to just describe that, I also need to build customer or user management systems. So, which of our agents are assigned to which stores, when they're scheduled to go, how we pay them, what we're actually tracking, the different data storage repositories, different data storage analysis systems. It's crazy. So we're going around. Our clients are impressed. We constantly get feedback about, man, you guys have done so much in just 2.5 years. And we're starting to now go and raise money, and so we go to the the world tour of different money management companies, and they're like, wow, this is really impressive. And I attribute it all because again, we only have 5 developers, and for a while there was just 3 of us, and then we just hired 2 guys, in 1 month, thankfully, at the beginning of the year, which is unheard of. Like, you open up a job rec, and we got 2 people right away, and I blame, or I attribute everything to the fact that we are using some of the latest technologies and some of the latest architectural styles that are out there, and it generates a lot of interest, and I think it's proven it out that we're able to scale and grow and adjust and rapidly evolve. So that was a lot.
I think you're a secret agent. I love that. That's super cool. Now, Ed is a bit of a secret agent too. I think you're going down to New York soon to talk at the UN.
Oh, wow.
What's that about?
Yeah, there's a group down there that's hosting a database camp.
Okay.
And the focus really is to kind of bring folks from the local community together at the UN and talk about open source, big data technologies, new SQL technologies, and really kind of provide a platform to introduce kind of a broader audience to some of the new tech in data management and database that hasn't been out,
So, in thinking about sort of, there's a lot of like these government big data things that I'm sure, Lauren, you're working on, and I would imagine the UN, they're very much interested in that. Lauren, have you been sort of working with a lot of other cities in the U.S. or around the world on some of those projects?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think one of the striking things for me coming from the private sector again into public sector is that there's no competition between cities the same way as there is. You might be Mets you might be Yankees or Red Sox, but there's not really, among the digital teams at least, between cities, you don't have the same competition. So there's a tremendous amount of collaboration that happens. What's nice to see is that there's also innovation in different pockets happening. So you'll see different cities, that have a few tinkerers in the data team, and then a few people in the transportation department or something at some city that are doing something cool. And there is a lot of collaboration between those folks. I think right now we're, as you talk about like a second wave for adoption, there's a really big transformation. It feels like that's happening as it relates to open data. And again, to this point of making that information really accessible for people, data is one of those things where if you're not a data geek, you may still want the upshot of the information. And I think you see it a lot in media now, actually, with things like 538 and Upshot and a lot of these media channels trying to make data digestible for people. And so figuring out how we bridge that gap where you're serving both those like data wonks, but then also you're serving, the average person and satisfying their need to consume that information. So I think that's really where we're seeing a lot of that transformation. But there's definitely, in addition to that, this question of whether you make the data available in the form of right now it's happening in the form of CSVs that you can download, which is crazy. I think we're very close, if not already on the way, to seeing governments producing APIs for all their information. And so that's sort of the, I guess, next wave of what I expect to see on our data teams.
Can I add one thing to that?
Yeah.
So I've been really impressed, and I don't know what the relation is between Boston and this, but the Hubway, the bike system, I'll use that. They have every year they have. So you can imagine they have an incredible amount of data. So when you check out a bike and you move it somewhere, that registers a travel event, and so they have this flurry of people of data that tracks people's movements and throughout the city and where the bikes are at any given moment. And every year they do a data challenge to try and they're like, here's all our data, and they try to get people to provide some meaning out of it. I just think that's amazing and an example of I think what you're talking about.
Yeah. No. Cool. Let's see. So, Jim.
Yes.
You work in a world where open data seems sort of like an oxymoron. In that, I feel like in healthcare, it's sort of like not, it almost like...
Yeah, let me share a couple stories. Well, it's fascinating that I'm actually getting more and more depressed sitting next to Lauren, because you always think of the public sector as usually lagging, and I'm like, man, are we lagging in healthcare? Just so you know, the only official approved electronic transportation mechanism for pharmacy prescriptions is a fax. So we are still dealing with 1970s technology. And you know what's there's an irony in this. You know how they verify that the fax came from an authorized prescriber?
Email?
No, by the number that's printed at the top of the fax, which is the number that you put in when you configure your fax machine at home. I'm not lying. So the open data concept is, there's multiple facets to this. In healthcare, it's becoming more and more important on how do you benchmark yourself against it. If you think about where we're going with accountable care organizations, and if you actually look at what's going on with the healthcare exchanges right now. So for those of you that don't know, the healthcare exchange is a zero-sum game. In other words, if you take in a population into your exchange that's of higher risk, you get money from another exchange that's potentially dealing with a lower risk population. So in the end, the amount of money coming into the exchanges is capped based on the payments, but it's balanced between who's dealing with this. So this notion of how do you benchmark yourself against other entities is becoming a bigger and bigger deal. And so the notion of, though it's almost creating this open data exchange or open data benchmarking in a very, very private, closed system. And it's really one of the challenges that we're facing right now. And it's one of the biggest demands in the marketplace. Whether you're an accountable care organization and you want to know how am I going to get bonused based on providing value care through a value-based care, or whether you're an exchange and you're trying to benchmark yourself against where you are, they all want to understand where they are against the playing field because there's a fixed amount of money coming in and they all want to get the most that they can out of it. And so it's just it's not open in the fact that I'm going to download, weather.com information to go and check where, and compare it against something else. It's really how am I sharing the information? And the challenge is that these same companies, so that not only that's a challenge, to complicate this, many of these companies that want to get this benchmarking information don't want to have their information included in the benchmark. So you now have this benchmark of a whole bunch of itty-bitty little guys that have no relevance whatsoever against, a very large guy because they don't want to include their information in the benchmark. So it's a level of complication, and it's really the fact that healthcare is so far lagging in the maturity space about understanding how to get this information processed, how do you want to use it. It's going to be an evolving thing, and it's going to be one of the biggest challenges faced. Healthcare.gov was a disaster, but that was a disaster just because they didn't manage it well. But until people start to really understand how data is going to really unlock the value in the healthcare system and that everybody's going to have to participate in order to do it, we're still a few years away from really seeing the vision that is being put out there with some of these regulations.
Jim is very good at gruesome stories.
Sorry, that's my last panel, I'm pretty sure.
Questions, comments? Yes, Laird.
Well, my name is Tony. Hello, everybody. Great panel. I really like digital and open data, but I'm going to ask a question about security, which because you touch on a lot of the great points of those issues. So can you add a spin on open data, open source? Now, okay, security threats. How you guys are dealing with those? Have you seen anything that's been more gruesome even?
So let me ask this question. I'm going to take your.
Yeah.
I'm going to say, how many of you have been involved with a data breach?
A data breach.
A data breach. So in the end, if we do this panel again, or if we all got back together again in a few years, I'm pretty sure everybody's hand would be raised if it hasn't been raised already. So it's really a managing, and I'll just jump in here and go from there. Because I was actually involved in a very large data breach. Actually, I'm not officially supposed to call it a data breach. It was a data event where somebody who had information that they weren't supposed to have. But the security is, I think you highlighted it very well. With the power of the data that's sitting in front of us, there's new security threat vectors that we need to deal with. And it's not Joe hacker or Joe employee. It's more like there's well-documented nation-state attacks going against pharmacy chains in Canada and in the United States to get this information. So as well as the fact that with more and more compute, we can come up with 80%, 90%, 100% accuracy without including, what is classically known as personal identifiable information, PII, so it's your name, your address, and your date of birth. You can get none of that and pretty much with a high % of accuracy figure out who you are just based on what magazines you're ordering, where you work, what your commute patterns are, how you ride your bike up and down the street. There's enough information there that you can start to whittle out the information down to a small enough block that you can pretty much, with some level of accuracy, get there. So the threat vectors in security are completely changing, and it's up to it's up to us in our roles to identify them and really manage the risks on this. And so it's really, you have to become educated on what are the appropriate risks you're personally going to take or your organization is going to take and going to address this. It's an ever-evolving landscape.
Can I add one thing to that?
Yeah.
So on a slightly different note, it is interesting if you adopt a security mechanism that comes from the open source world. Right? There's an assumption that, right, so you have this open source project, you got potentially thousands of people looking at it, and everyone can see the code, everyone can analyze it and make sure that everything in there is kosher. And yet, who here has heard of the Heartbleed bug that came out a while ago? Right? So there was OpenSSL. It was an open system for designing security, and yet some person submitted a pull request that came through that no one really bothered to check, and a little while later, we had this massive security breach that people scrambled to fix. So as great as open source is, it's if you didn't write, even if you did write it, it's still hard to trust everything that might happen because there's always going to be bugs. I don't know, I just thought that's a fun anecdote.
But, I think, I'll just piggyback on that, but I do think the inherent advantage of open source communities is you've got, it's open and you've got continuous peer review.
That's right.
And so things like Heartbleed, we hear about those things because they're kind of...
They're rare?
They happen in a truly public forum, but we don't hear about all the security breaches that happen with proprietary software companies.
Patch Tuesday?
Patch Tuesday.
I think I think they're known to happen at a much higher rate of frequency than open source. We hear about the ones that are, because they're prolific technologies when they're open source, but they're also talked about publicly. Like everybody in the community handles that problem pretty quickly.
Yeah.
So I think there's an inherent advantage to that. I think I'd say that across most of our customers, it's recognized. I think all of our customers that it's an inherent advantage to open source technology over proprietary technology.
Oh yeah, no, I completely trust open source technologies more than I do, whatever some vendor's providing. Absolutely. On a completely separate note, I would love to see open source voting systems as well. That's a completely different topic.
Wish that were happening. No, but I think just to piggyback onto that too, I think one thing that's been really interesting is that data is almost becoming like a tradable commodity, and you already see market clearinghouses for companies selling data of their customers and things like that. But the city, I can speak to that anyway, is increasingly pairing or partnering with companies like Hubway or like Waze or Uber that have great information about drivers. Like we can A/B test traffic changes based off of how it's affecting the cross traffic. We can decide to give green light priority to a bus route just to see what happens to the cross traffic, and that's only possible because we have all this other data happening, and so. Those partnerships are really valuable, but on the other hand, it does expose the city to a lot of risks if we begin sharing data the other way. And so I think it's one thing to think about your own company and keep track and wrangle all of those sort of databases, but then at the same time think about what your partners are responsible for and their adherence to best practices.
I have gotten a signal that it is time to wrap, but I believe that we can chat and other questions that you were too scared to raise your hand, you can chat with us. This is the lightning round where we're doing the I've Got Postgres Vision for anticipation of our event in October in San Francisco. Let's see. I'd say the speedboat, you're going to go first, and then we'll go down the line and end with Ed. We've invited you back 3 years from now. What is your prediction on what we'll be talking about?
We're all going to celebrate the death of IBM. No, but more realistically, I think we'd have a discussion about who is paying for open source, where the money is. So, one of the things that I find interesting is that, we use all these tools, and if something goes wrong, there's no one we can lean on to fix. It's up to us to fix it. So what we end up tending to use are systems and tools that have some sort of financial backing from some company. So an example of this are companies like Pivotal or Red Hat. Red Hat, like you pointed out, made $2 billion last year on the back of open source. So they have these open source tools, and then they build like a SaaS offering or consulting on top of that, and that's where they make their money. And so there's this. They have full teams that are there to support and resolve any issues you might find with these tools. I mean, that being said, we don't, not everything is Spring, but if Pivotal went under, I don't know what we do because we lose, support for RabbitMQ and Spring, and it'd be a disaster. But so I think having a discussion about how these projects are funded and encouraging maintenance, I think would be a very interesting topic.
All right, Lauren, what's your Postgres vision for 3 years from now?
I guess for me, and this goes back to what I was saying earlier, in 3 years, which isn't very long in government, I think we blur the lines between what is public and what is private sector, and how you interact with that entity. So how we empower people to get that pothole on their street fixed, and how people identify as being engaged with government or not. And so my hope is that you don't have to attend communities and in order to feel like an engaged citizen. And I think that the way we do that is through a combination of digital and still some analog tools that help us get there. But I don't see that happening with Oracle procurements.
All right, and 3 years is sort of like 3 days in healthcare. So where will you be?
Or more like 3 decades in some cases. I think there's open source and Moore's law and the cost of compute is going to really radicalize healthcare. You're already starting to see it with companies such as Oscar. So what's interesting is still the basis of healthcare is COBOL on a mainframe. Believe it or not, the majority of all of the claims that are processed in this world are COBOL on a mainframe. Your 9-month-old should learn COBOL because it's probably there's going to be a marketplace for that. But I think in healthcare, with the onset of Oscar and some more disruptive things, because things are between open source and compute, I really think that healthcare is going to go on its ear. And we're going to not read in the Wall Street Journal about how people are concerned about the Anthem-Cigna merger. We're going to see the Oscar buyout of Anthem. Just like we saw AOL buying Time Warner a couple decades ago. And I think that's where we're going to, and I don't know if we'll be there in 3 years, but I think that's where this is going to be, is that there's going to be some startup that's going to figure out open source, that's going to figure out data, that's going to figure out how interoperability is key to where we need to go in healthcare. And they're going to have it demonstrated through being able to make money and pay providers and people to stay healthy. And that whole transition is going to have to take place here in the next few years. And so I think we'll start to see the inklings or the possibility of that in 3 years from now.
Okay, we might invite you back to talk about
Okay.
that. Ed, what is your Postgres vision?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. I think we're going to see a remarkable amount of consolidation in the software tech space, and I think that landscape's going to really start to look different. The big traditional proprietary vendors aren't going to look so traditional and proprietary anymore. They may be the acquirers or they may be acquired, but that landscape's going to change. We're right at the front edge of that. And I think underneath that is something that we'll see both in the tech space, but I think in the broader enterprise space, and that's that open source development will become a standard part of enterprise IT operations. It will no longer be guys like us who have open source developers who work on commercial endeavors, but also are expected to work for the benefit of a community. That IT organizations, traditional Fortune 500 IT organizations, are not only going to encourage that behavior, but expect that behavior and reward that behavior. And then kind of open source, the value of open source is going to grow exponentially with that.
Awesome. All right, that was the last word. Ed, thank you, and thank you to a wonderful panel. I hope you all enjoyed the discussion. I think we have time for another glass of wine and to finish up all that food out there and continue this conversation. Enjoy your Postgres Vision sunglasses. I encourage you to put them on, tweet a fun selfie. What is our hashtag?
I've got hashtag Postgres Vision.
Thank you. Do it. And thank you. You're a great audience.
Yeah.